Cousins got new iPhones and tablets. I got socks and homemade cookies. I thought Grandma just didn't have money for everyone, until I saw her bank statements. Every Christmas morning felt like a carefully orchestrated performance where I knew my role but never understood why I had to play it. The living room would fill with torn wrapping paper and excited squeals as my cousins unwrapped their latest treasures. Jessica would gasp over her new designer purse or the latest smartphone, while Michael would already be setting up whatever gaming console or expensive gadget had been waiting under the tree with his name on it. Meanwhile, I'd sit quietly in the corner, running my fingers over yet another hand-knitted sweater that smelled faintly of mothballs and good intentions. The pattern was so predictable it became a twisted form of Christmas tradition. My cousins received electronics worth hundreds of dollars, brand-name clothing, gift cards to expensive stores, and sometimes even checks with amounts that made my parents exchange uncomfortable glances. My pile was always smaller, filled with homemade preserves in mason jars, thick wool socks that scratched against my skin, and maybe a $20 bill tucked inside a card that read something about the value of simple pleasures. Grandma would watch the unwrapping ceremony from her favorite armchair, her eyes lighting up when Jessica squealed over a new tablet or when Michael hugged her tightly after discovering the latest gaming headset. When it came to my turn, she'd nod approvingly as I held up whatever handcrafted item she'd spent weeks making, her voice taking on a different tone as she explained that the real gifts in life weren't the ones you could buy in stores. She'd pat my shoulder and remind me that everything she made was created with love, that the time and effort she put into knitting or baking was worth more than anything money could purchase. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But watching my cousins' faces glow with genuine excitement while I forced a smile over another jar of pickled vegetables made something twist uncomfortably in my chest. The difference wasn't lost on anyone in the room, though the adults pretended not to notice the disparity. My parents would quickly change the subject when I asked why my gifts were always so different, telling me I should be grateful for any attention at all and that Grandma's handmade presents showed how much she cared about me personally. The excuses became a familiar chorus over the years. Maybe Grandma was running low on funds after buying the expensive gifts for Jessica and Michael. Maybe she thought I was too young for electronics. Maybe she believed I'd appreciate the personal touch more than store-bought items. I cycled through every possible explanation, desperately trying to make sense of why my grandmother's love seemed to come with such different price tags depending on which grandchild was receiving it. Birthday celebrations followed the same script. Jessica's sweet 16 came with a diamond necklace and a shopping spree at the mall. Michael's 18th birthday brought a brand new laptop for college. My birthdays were marked by homemade cakes that tasted slightly off and craft projects that looked like they'd been assembled by someone who wasn't quite sure what they were doing. The effort was there, I could see that, but so was the stark contrast between what my cousins received and what I unwrapped with increasingly forced enthusiasm. High school graduation season brought the most painful revelation yet. Jessica received a check for $5,000 toward her college expenses, presented with great ceremony at the family dinner. Michael got even more the following year, along with a brand new car that Grandma insisted was necessary for his success. When my graduation arrived, I found myself hoping that maybe this milestone would be different, that maybe I'd finally receive something that reflected the significance of the achievement. Instead, I got a photo album filled with pictures of our family over the years and a $50 savings bond that wouldn't mature for another decade. Grandma spent 20 minutes explaining how memories were the most precious gifts of all, how the photo album represented years of love and family connections that no amount of money could buy. I nodded and smiled and thanked her while my chest felt hollow and strange, like something important had been scooped out and replaced with disappointment that I wasn't allowed to express. The conversations with my parents became more strained as I got older. They'd insist that I was being ungrateful, that I should focus on the thought behind the gifts rather than their monetary value. They'd point out that Grandma spent hours working on my presents, that the time and effort she invested showed how much I meant to her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the whole situation, that there was an explanation no one was willing to share with me. College application time brought new challenges. While my cousins had their tuition partially covered by Grandma's generous contributions, I found myself applying for every scholarship and grant available, working part-time jobs to save money for expenses that seemed insurmountable. My parents did their best to help, but their resources were limited, and watching Jessica and Michael coast through their education with financial support I could only dream of made the inequality even more stark. The breaking point came during my sophomore year when Grandma had a health scare that landed her in the hospital for several weeks. Since I was the only family member living nearby, I became the designated helper, running errands and managing her affairs while she recovered. My parents were grateful that I could step in, and even Grandma seemed to appreciate having someone around to handle the day-to-day tasks that had become difficult for her. Update 1. Sorting through Grandma's mail and paperwork became a daily routine. I'd collect everything from her mailbox, organize bills that needed attention, and make sure important documents didn't get lost in the shuffle. It was tedious work, but I felt useful for the first time in years, like I was finally contributing something valuable to our family dynamic. Grandma would thank me from her hospital bed, her voice weak but genuine, and for a moment I'd feel like maybe I'd been wrong about everything. That illusion shattered completely when I opened her monthly bank statement to check for any automatic payments that might need attention. The numbers on the page made me blink hard, convinced I was misreading something. Her pension alone was more than both my parents made in a year combined. Her savings account balance had more zeros than I'd ever seen outside of a movie. She had multiple investment accounts, certificates of deposit, and a money market account that could have funded several college educations without making a noticeable dent. My hands shook as I stared at the papers, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't someone struggling to make ends meet or carefully budgeting limited resources. This was someone with more money than most people see in a lifetime, someone who could have easily afforded to treat all her grandchildren equally but had chosen not to. The homemade gifts, the explanations about love being more important than money, the entire narrative I'd been fed for years crumbled into dust as I sat in her kitchen surrounded by evidence of her wealth. The next few days passed in a haze of confused emotions. I continued helping with her affairs, but every interaction felt different now. When she complained about the hospital bills, I knew she could pay them without thinking twice. When she mentioned needing to be careful with her spending, I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The woman who had given my cousins thousands of dollars worth of gifts over the years while handing me handmade crafts was worth more money than I'd ever imagined possible. I tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe she was saving the money for something important. Maybe she had medical expenses I didn't know about. Maybe there was some logical explanation that would make everything make sense again. But the more I thought about it, the more hollow those excuses sounded. The bank statements showed regular large expenditures that coincided perfectly with Christmas and birthday seasons, amounts that matched exactly what I'd estimated my cousin's gifts had cost over the years. Sleep became impossible as I replayed every holiday gathering, every forced smile, every time I'd been told to be grateful for the thought behind a gift while watching my cousins enjoy items that cost more than my family's monthly grocery budget. The anger started as a small flame in my chest but grew into something that made my whole body feel hot and restless. I'd been played for a fool, and everyone in the family had been in on it except me. When Grandma was finally released from the hospital, I helped her get settled back into her house, but the dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. She seemed to sense something was different in the way I moved around her space, the way I answered her questions with shorter responses and avoided making eye contact for too long. I couldn't bring myself to confront her directly about what I'd discovered, but I also couldn't pretend everything was normal. The tension reached a breaking point during a family dinner a few weeks later. Jessica was showing off her new designer watch, another expensive gift from Grandma for no particular occasion except that she'd seen it in a store window and thought it would look nice on her granddaughter. Michael was talking about the gaming setup Grandma had helped him purchase for his dorm room, complete with equipment that cost more than most people's cars. I sat quietly, picking at my food and trying not to let the bitterness show on my face. After dinner, I found myself alone with my aunt in the kitchen while the others watched television in the living room. She was Jessica's mother, and I'd always felt like she pitted me during family gatherings, though I'd never understood why. Something about her expression that evening made me finally ask the question I'd been avoiding for weeks. I asked her quietly why she thought Grandma's gifts were always so different for me compared to what Jessica and Michael received. I tried to keep my voice neutral, like I was just curious rather than hurt and angry and confused. My aunt stopped washing dishes and turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between sympathy and discomfort. What she told me next made my stomach drop to somewhere around my knees. Grandma had never been secretive about her reasoning with the other adults in the family. She considered my parents failures, people who had made bad choices and couldn't be trusted to handle money responsibly. She worried that giving me expensive gifts would somehow enable their irresponsible behavior, that I might come to expect handouts the way she believed my parents did. Update 2. The conversation with my aunt continued in hushed tones as she explained years of family dynamics I'd never been privy to. According to her, Grandma had been vocal about her disappointment in my parents' career choices, their financial struggles, and what she perceived as their inability to provide properly for their child. She saw Jessica's and Michael's parents as successful, responsible adults who deserved to have their children rewarded. Meanwhile, she viewed my family as a cautionary tale of what happened when people didn't work hard enough or make smart decisions. My aunt's words felt like physical blows as she described conversations that had happened at family gatherings I'd attended, discussions about my future that had taken place while I played in the next room. Completely unaware that my grandmother was writing me off as a lost cause because of who my parents were. The expensive gifts my cousins received weren't just expressions of love, they were rewards for having parents who met Grandma's standards of success and responsibility. Even worse was learning that this wasn't some secret shame my aunt felt guilty about revealing. Grandma had been open with the other adults about her reasoning, apparently believing that her logic was sound and that everyone would understand why she treated her grandchildren differently. The homemade gifts weren't expressions of special love, they were consolation prizes designed to make me feel included while ensuring I never received anything of real value. The revelation explained so many small moments I'd filed away over the years without understanding their significance. The way conversations would stop when I entered a room during family gatherings. The uncomfortable glances between adults when gift opening time arrived. The way my cousins sometimes seemed almost embarrassed by their expensive presents, not because they didn't want them, but because they could see how the disparity affected me even if they didn't fully understand why it existed. I left the dinner feeling like my entire childhood had been recontextualized. Every holiday memory was now tainted with the knowledge that my grandmother's love had come with conditions I'd never known existed. The woman who had hugged me and told me I was special had simultaneously been telling other family members that I wasn't worth investing in because of who my parents were. The disconnect between her words and actions suddenly made perfect sense in the most painful way possible. Sleep became even more elusive as I processed this new information. I'd lie awake replaying conversations, remembering moments when I'd defended Grandma to friends who questioned why her gifts to me were always so different. I'd insisted that she loved me just as much as my cousins, that the handmade presents were actually more meaningful because of the time and effort she'd invested. Now those defenses felt like lies I'd told myself to avoid facing a truth that was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The anger I'd felt after discovering her bank statements evolved into something deeper and more complex. I wasn't just hurt by the inequality anymore, I was devastated by the deception. She'd let me believe that her love for me was expressed through homemade gifts while simultaneously telling other family members that I wasn't worth the same investment as my cousins. The betrayal felt complete and absolute, like the foundation of one of my most important relationships had been built on quicksand. My relationship with my parents became strained as I struggled with whether to tell them what I'd learned. They'd spent years defending Grandma's behavior, insisting that I should be grateful for her attention and not focus on the monetary value of gifts. But now I knew they'd been defending someone who viewed them as failures and was punishing me for their perceived shortcomings. The knowledge felt like a burden I couldn't share without destroying what little family harmony we had left. The next family gathering was torture. Watching Grandma interact with Jessica and Michael felt like seeing a completely different person than the one who spoke to me. Her voice was warmer with them, her interest in their lives more genuine, her pride in their accomplishments more obvious. When she turned to me, I could see the difference now that I knew what to look for. The smile was smaller, the questions more perfunctory, the attention more obligatory than enthusiastic. I started avoiding family events when possible, making excuses about work or school commitments that prevented me from attending dinners and celebrations. When I did show up, I kept conversations brief and left as early as politely possible. My parents noticed the change in my behavior but attributed it to stress from college and work rather than anything more serious. I let them believe that explanation because it was easier than opening a conversation that would inevitably hurt everyone involved. The situation reached a crisis point during Christmas of my junior year. Grandma had prepared her usual assortment of homemade gifts for me while presenting my cousins with checks for their upcoming study abroad programs, amounts that would cover their entire expenses for months in Europe. As I sat in her living room holding a knitted scarf that had probably cost her $10 in materials while my cousins planned international adventures funded by her generosity, something inside me finally snapped. I found myself standing up abruptly, the scarf falling to the floor as I announced that I needed to leave. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at me, confusion and concern written across their faces. My parents started to protest, reminding me that we hadn't even had dinner yet, but I was already grabbing my coat and heading for the door. I couldn't spend another minute in that room pretending to be grateful for scraps while watching my cousins receive gifts that would change their lives. Update 3. The drive home from that Christmas gathering was a blur of tears and rage. I'd finally reached the point where I couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't force another smile or express gratitude I didn't feel. The years of conditioning that had taught me to be thankful for any attention at all had finally crumbled under the weight of what I now knew to be true. My grandmother's love was conditional, rationed, and based on judgments about my parents that I'd had no control over or knowledge of. My phone buzzed constantly with concerned messages from family members wondering why I'd left so suddenly. My parents called multiple times, their voices worried and confused as they asked what was wrong and whether something had happened to upset me. I couldn't bring myself to answer any of the calls because I knew that explaining would mean revealing everything I'd learned, and I wasn't ready for the conversation that would inevitably follow. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to feel the full depth of my anger about the situation. I'd spent years suppressing my hurt feelings, telling myself that I was being selfish or ungrateful for wanting more than what I received. But now I understood that my feelings had been valid all along. The inequality had been real, intentional, and based on prejudices that had nothing to do with who I was as a person. The realization that I'd been gaslit by my entire family was almost as painful as learning about Grandma's true feelings. Every time an adult had told me to be grateful for the thought behind a gift, they'd known that the disparity was deliberate and cruel. Every time I'd been reminded that love wasn't about money, I'd been listening to people who knew that money was being deliberately withheld based on their own mother's prejudices about my parents. I spent the next few days in isolation, avoiding family calls and trying to figure out how to move forward with this new understanding of my relationships. The people I trusted most had been complicit in a deception that had shaped my entire childhood, and I wasn't sure how to forgive that level of betrayal. The foundation of trust that family relationships are supposed to be built on felt like it had been completely eroded. When I finally answered my parents' calls, I made a decision that surprised even me. I told them everything. I described finding the bank statements, learning about Grandma's true financial situation, and discovering her reasoning for treating me differently. I watched their faces change as they processed what I was telling them, seeing their own hurt and anger begin to mirror mine as they understood the full scope of what had been happening. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult we'd ever had as a family. My parents admitted that they'd suspected something wasn't quite right about the gift disparity, but had chosen to believe Grandma's explanations rather than confront the possibility that she was deliberately excluding me. They'd wanted to protect me from feeling unwanted or unloved, so they'd encouraged me to focus on the positive aspects of her attention rather than questioning the inequality. Learning that my parents had been as deceived as I was provided some comfort, but it also made the situation feel more complex. We were all victims of Grandma's prejudices, but we'd also all participated in maintaining the fiction that her behavior was acceptable. My parents had unknowingly taught me to accept less than I deserved, and I'd internalized those lessons so thoroughly that I defended my grandmother's actions even when they hurt me. The decision about how to handle the situation going forward felt overwhelming. Confronting Grandma directly would likely destroy our relationship entirely, but continuing to pretend everything was normal felt impossible now that I knew the truth. My parents were struggling with the same dilemma, torn between their love for their daughter and their complicated feelings about the woman who had raised them. We decided to try a middle ground approach. Instead of cutting off contact entirely, we would attend family gatherings but with completely different expectations. I would no longer pretend to be grateful for gifts that were designed to make me feel lesser than my cousins. I would stop defending Grandma's behavior to others or to myself. Most importantly, I would stop allowing her judgments about my parents to influence how I felt about myself or my family. The next family dinner was awkward in ways I'd never experienced before. Instead of trying to smooth over uncomfortable moments or fill silences with forced conversation, I simply let the tension exist. When Grandma made comments about the importance of hard work and making good choices, I didn't nod along or try to show that I understood her point. When she presented me with another homemade gift while giving my cousins something expensive, I accepted it politely but without the enthusiasm I'd previously forced myself to display. My cousins began to notice the change in family dynamics, though they didn't understand what had caused it. Jessica asked me privately if I was okay, mentioning that I seemed different during recent gatherings. I found myself in the strange position of wanting to protect her from knowledge that would hurt her while also feeling resentful that she'd been benefiting from a system that deliberately excluded me. Our relationship, which had always been somewhat strained by the inequality between us, became even more complicated. The most unexpected part of this entire situation was discovering my own strength. For years, I defined myself as the grateful grandchild who appreciated whatever attention she received. Learning to advocate for myself, to recognize when I was being treated unfairly, and to stop accepting explanations that didn't make sense felt like developing a completely new personality. I was becoming someone who valued herself enough to demand better treatment, even from family members. Final update. The transformation in how I approached family relationships had ripple effects I hadn't anticipated. My parents, emboldened by our conversations about Grandma's behavior, began setting boundaries they'd never established before. They stopped making excuses for the gift disparity and started acknowledging that the situation was unfair and hurtful. For the first time in my life, I felt like my parents were truly in my corner rather than trying to manage my feelings to keep peace in the family. This shift in family dynamics culminated in a conversation that changed everything. My parents decided to speak directly with Grandma about what they'd learned, not to attack her but to express how her actions had affected their daughter and their family. They approached the conversation with love but also with clarity about what needed to change if they were going to continue having a relationship with her. Grandma's reaction was more complex than any of us had expected. Initially, she was defensive, insisting that her reasoning was sound and that she'd been trying to teach important lessons about not spoiling children whose parents couldn't provide for them properly. But as the conversation continued, she began to see how her actions had affected me personally, how her judgments about my parents had resulted in punishing an innocent child who had no control over her family's circumstances. The breakthrough came when my parents shared specific examples of how I'd defended her over the years, how I'd insisted to friends that her love was expressed through handmade gifts rather than expensive purchases. Hearing about my loyalty to her while knowing that she'd been deliberately excluding me from the generosity she showed other grandchildren seemed to affect her in ways that surprised everyone in the room. What followed was the most honest conversation our family had ever had about money, fairness, and the way love should be expressed within families. Grandma admitted that her prejudices about my parents had clouded her judgment about how to treat me, and she acknowledged that her behavior had been harmful and unfair. She couldn't undo years of inequality, but she could commit to treating all her grandchildren with equal generosity going forward. The changes weren't immediate or dramatic, but they were real. The next gift-giving occasion brought a genuine surprise. I received a check for the same amount my cousins had been getting, along with an apology for years of disparity. More importantly, I noticed changes in how Grandma spoke to me and about me during family gatherings. The warmth in her voice became genuine rather than obligatory, and her interest in my life seemed to match the attention she'd always given my cousins. Perhaps most surprisingly, my relationship with Jessica and Michael improved dramatically once the inequality between us was addressed. Without the underlying tension of unfair treatment, we could finally develop genuine friendships rather than relationships strained by resentment and awkwardness. They admitted that they'd always felt uncomfortable about the gift disparity but hadn't known how to address it without making the situation worse. The experience taught me lessons about family dynamics that I never could have learned any other way. I discovered that love within families can be conditional and unfair, but it can also evolve and improve when people are willing to have difficult conversations. I learned that advocating for yourself doesn't mean being ungrateful or selfish. It means recognizing your own worth and insisting that others recognize it too. Looking back on the years of homemade gifts and forced gratitude, I feel a complex mixture of sadness for my younger self and pride in the person I've become. The child who accepted inequality as normal and defended the person who was treating her unfairly has grown into someone who can identify injustice and work to change it. The pain of those years wasn't meaningless if it taught me to value myself and demand better treatment from the people who claim to love me. The relationship with my grandmother will never be the same as it was when I believed her explanations about the meaning of love and gifts. But in some ways, it's better now because it's based on honesty rather than deception. She knows that I know the truth about her past behavior, and I know that she's committed to doing better going forward. Trust has to be rebuilt rather than assumed, but that foundation might ultimately be stronger than what we had before. My parents and I emerged from this experience with a deeper understanding of each other and a shared commitment to honest communication about difficult topics. They learned that protecting me from painful truths hadn't actually protected me at all, and I learned that they were capable of standing up for me when they understood the full scope of what was happening. Our family became stronger through conflict rather than despite it. The most important lesson I took from this entire situation is that family love shouldn't require you to accept less than you deserve or to be grateful for treatment that makes you feel less valuable than others. Real love recognizes your worth and demonstrates it through actions that match loving words. Anything less isn't love, it's manipulation dressed up in family obligations and traditional expectations. Now when I see families struggling with similar dynamics, I encourage them to have the difficult conversations that might seem easier to avoid. The temporary discomfort of addressing inequality is worth the long-term benefit of relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. Everyone deserves to feel valued by their family members, and settling for less cheats everyone involved out of the authentic connections that make family relationships worthwhile. The homemade gifts from those early years still sit in my closet, but they mean something different now. Instead of representing the love I convinced myself they symbolized, they remind me of the person I was before I learned to advocate for myself. They're artifacts of a time when I accepted explanations that didn't make sense because I was afraid to demand better treatment from someone I loved. Looking at them now, I feel compassion for that younger version of myself and pride in how far I've come since then.